Here we have a high classical image from the 1740s by shoemakers. It's a Shakespeare. You can see the beginning of the cult of the artistic personality in this work. You can see also the beginning of an almost cultic reverence for Shakespeare as a writer, which reaches a sort of status of a secular god almost in modernity, particularly in Anglophone culture. Occasionally regarded as rough and unhewn and Elizabethan and rather barbaric, Shakespeare comes in over stages and is gradually accepted despite certain Augustan and Victorian moral qualms with some of the plays or their style. Shakespeare is depicted as a heroic creator gazing upon the muses, and this is the beginning of a classical cultivation of artistic biography that will reach an apogee with endless versions of Beethoven's face and upper body and torso and bust and so on in the 19th century atop almost every Victorian mantelpiece or piano. But this importance of the individual creative personality depicted physically becomes more and more apparent. Don't forget, we're emerging from a period where priests, where warriors, where kings and queens were put into this form. Now the artist himself becomes the subject of his work. Here we have another piece of a sort of military character drawn from classical myth and history, the death of Germanicus by Thomas Banks from the 1770s. The naked corpse, warriors swoon around it. Some of the peripheral figures are almost in relief. Their three-dimensionality is tapered and is moving back into the stonework. But the key central characters, two of which are youths or small children, are depicted almost three-dimensionally. Other background characters again merge more into the stonework. So you've got this sort of relief tending to radical representationality. It is an attempt in high 18th century formulation to recap what they believe the sculpture of the ancient world to have been like and how it comes down to us, both from classical Greek sculptors like Praxiteles, but also from Hellenistic sculpture, dug up again and made to bear witness in the imperial papacies of the High Renaissance. We have an extraordinary and interesting piece which almost goes outside sculpture and then steps back into it again. This is of the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, a key founder of modern liberalism as it's come to be seen and practiced. He wears a sort of Quakerish hat, and this is his corpse. This is an example of corpse art, one of almost the first in the West. It's called an auto-icon, and he believed that everyone should have themselves exhibited as a corpse and as a sort of artwork stroke sculpture after death. This extant form is still around. You can still see it in the precincts of University College London and Senate House in Bloomsbury. If you notice, his sort of decapitated head stroke facial mask, or one version of it, is between his feet. Increasingly this sculpture is in very great disrepair, and the head is believed to be full of maggoty blood and this sort of thing, because the non-cryogenic processes by which it was embalmed and created and frozen in time from the 1830s to today in the 21st century has gradually destroyed it. However, although this appears to many sensibilities to be ghoulish and freakish, this is part of a long Western tradition in its way. The death mask, the birth mask, the mask that's taken from your face in adulthood. This was done for Keats, it was done for Beethoven, it was done for Cromwell, it was done for Napoleon, it was done for Wellington, it was done for all sorts of figures, and was regarded as quite normal. Also, art and anatomy have always gone together since the ancient world, and many artists see themselves closer to surgeons in their coolness, coldness and objectivity than they do to necessarily emotionally based artists. It's often a misconception of people who are never involved in the arts to think it's all about emotion and not about reason. Bearing in mind that Western art is based upon the body, the cult of the body and of the body's decay in and towards death is inevitably part of this. In anatomy, the tradition from Galen through Vesalius, and now through in the 20th century to controversial practitioners of a sort of hybrid of the arts and the sciences, such as the German embalmer and contemporary anatomist Professor Gunther von Hagen, are all part of this tradition that Bentham opened up with this piece. What Bentham is really saying is, here is my corpse, let my face and head be cut off and used as a sort of something for people to look at. Let my eyes be cut out and used as marbles by the children of tomorrow. It's a totally materialistic attitude towards death that believes there is nothing after. One is reminded of Danton, the French revolutionary, who, when on the scaffold, turned to the executioner and said, "Show my head to the people, it's worth looking at." Here we have, again, a very Grecian model. It's by Henning, it's from 1828. It's at Hyde Park Corner. Of course, millions of tourists and native inhabitants will have passed this, sometimes without seeing it at all, day on day, in the centre of London. It's based upon the idea of the Parthenon and the Elgin marbles and what they meant when they were brought over from Greece. And it's yet another part of the heroicising tendencies of early 19th century art, this idea that we were the new Greece and the new Rome combined, and that in a rather Christianised way we could nevertheless bring the solidity of the ancient world to the modern, particularly in relation to memorials that dealt with war and sacrifice. I have a mid-19th century bust and sculpture which depicts the artist as hero, or at the very best artistic and yet heroic figure. It's of the poet laureate Tennyson, best known to sort of middle 20th century audiences by his poem to celebrate the defeat, as it were, of the charge of the Light Brigade. He's depicted in a biographical or representational and a rather realist or naturalistic manner, and not bewigged, well out of the 18th century, a studied and sort of low-key heroic on-bit to the piece, and yet it's the artist as hero who gazes out with a solemn and mature gaze. It's a sort of how they believe in the middle of the 19th century the classical world would have depicted a significant writer like Dio Cassius or Pliny or Catullus. Here in this sort of line or column of figures seen from the side is a depiction in slight relief but nevertheless three-dimensionally of a catalogue or chronology of British sculptors, famous ones anyway. This is from the Albert Memorial by Armstead and Phillip, and many of the people that we've looked at in terms of their works earlier in this film are depicted here. Of course, there's a certain element of artistic imagination and license going on, because how would the sculptors entirely have known of the physiology of their forebears and predecessors, artistically speaking? But nonetheless, we begin with Nicholas Stone, who we looked at several centuries before in this chronology. Bird is there. John Bushnell, whose eccentricities we mentioned at one moment, is also depicted, along with Bernini and various people from the continent who infused the solidity of the English style with a certain Renaissance lightness of touch. Now moving from the middle of the Victorian period towards its end, and the Romantic movement has certainly infused sculpture. It took a long time. Painting would be far more likely to succumb to Romantic treatment in terms of Constable's way of looking at nature, Turner's in pre-impressionism, or the sort of Salvatore Rosa view of nature as seen in a Gothic and troubled manner. Three-dimensionally it would be more difficult to bring in the Romantic idea, but here it is in Lord Leighton's sculpture. Now, one thing that you notice is because the idealising tendencies of classicism are reduced, the sculpture is more naturalistic, and therefore the nude will obviously be depicted more sexually, or at least psychosexually. This caused, in the High Victorian period, of course, quite a bit of consternation. But if you like, the nude is becoming more real, and one has this paradox about Victorian culture, that in an era which is regarded by modernity as very repressive and judgmental, nevertheless its three-dimensional art is increasingly erotic in terms of the nature of the classical tradition.